Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. Today, I want to start by telling you a story. In this story is Jake. Jake's a software engineer, and he's currently working on an ambitious new web application, and he and his team are super excited about the project. However, as often happens, it's a few weeks behind schedule, and they just had to spend a long week wrapping up a key feature. Now, it's a Monday, and Jake is feeling extra worn out because he had to deal with some family problems over the weekend. He would really like a day off, but he doesn't have any PTO, and he knows that the rest of his team is hard at work. So he decides to tough it out and head into the office. The first thing he does when he gets there is check on that pull request he opened on Friday. He sees he got a review and wants to check the comments on it. But it turns out there was only one comment, and it was left by a senior engineer on his team. And it says, "This won't work. That's it. Nothing else." So since he started out pretty tired, Jake's already beginning to feel some frustration. He's thinking to himself, well, why won't this work? It is what was asked, and I worked hard on it. But he moves on. He has a meeting coming up. It's his first meeting of the day, and it's a one-on-one with his manager. He gets to the meeting a bit early, hoping that he'd be able to have some time to talk about his frustrations and some problems going on with the project. But as soon as his manager gets to the door, he asks him, "Have you finished feature X?" This feature was supposed to be delivered last week, but due to issues with other teams, he was then able to finish it on time. And so they spend their whole time discussing that. So when Jake leaves this meeting, he's thinking to himself, no, it's not finished, but that's not what I wanted to talk about. So it's about lunchtime now, and he heads to lunch with his teammates. Since his meeting ran a bit long, though, by the time he gets to the lunch table, they're already in conversation. Jake's hoping that they could talk about something other than tech for a little bit, and seeing as it is a Monday, he's hoping that maybe they have some weekend stories that they could share. However, they're already in conversation, and they're talking about the latest JavaScript framework. Did you hear about New-Thing.js? Jake hasn't heard of this because he was dealing with family issues over the weekend, and so he's thinking to himself, great, yet another thing that I need to go learn. This feeds into his already negative emotions about the day. There's so much going on for him. There's too much going on. So it's after lunch now, and Jake really just wants to go home, so he sulks back to his desk and kind of just fires up his text editor. He can't quite get into flow with his work, and so he checks his emails and checks Twitter a bunch and kind of just sits there quietly until the clock finally hits 5, and he feels, okay, I've put in a full day, I can go home. So, how many of you have ever had a day like Jake just did? A day where you feel tired and worn out, and like no one's really supporting you and the frustrations you're having at work. I know I have. Jake's story here is similar to parts of my own story, and I imagine they're similar to many stories that could be shared in this audience. My name is Trent Willis, and I'm a senior UI engineer at Netflix currently. And today I want to talk about a skill that I believe is really, really important for our industry, but often crucially undervalued. That is the ability to care for your fellow developers. You see, the tragic thing about the story with Jake is that this one disappointing and discouraging day can easily turn into weeks or months of feeling worn out at work. This means lost productivity, lower team morale, and potentially, if things are bad enough, the loss of a talented employee. So how could things have gone differently? How could the interactions that have occurred between Jake and his coworkers have been made better without them knowing what was going through Jake's mind or necessarily going on in Jake's personal life? That's what we're going to explore for the remainder of this talk. So to start, I want us to focus on this first word, caring. In context, it's an action. It's not a state of being, but something which you perform. In speaking with other developers and managers, I've often found that we talk about caring or empathy in high-level or abstract terms. We don't really speak frequently about the actions which we think represent someone caring, and even less do we talk about how those apply to people that aren't in leadership positions. The good news here, though, is that since caring is an action, it means that there are some specific acts and thought processes we can employ to be more caring. And since they are actions, that means we can practice them. And if we can practice them, that means we can get better at them. And it also means that we can work at them together and work with each other to improve. So now's a good time for me to mention that I'm not a caring person by nature. I'm an introvert in that I get drained from interacting with other people. So being supportive, especially in emotionally hard times, is really difficult. Additionally, I can have a hard time relating to others at points and often like to keep to myself. I'm sure at least some of you know what this is like. However, I've been tremendously lucky to have wonderful people in my life, especially in the workplace, that have called me out on how I interact with coworkers and encouraged me to be better at it, to strive to be better. So now I look at it this way. I respect my limitations, but I don't use them as an excuse. And what I mean by this is I know that I'm going to have to put in a little extra bit of effort in order to be more caring and supportive of my teammates, but that's no reason for me not to do it. We're all humans first and developers second, and I definitely put in lots of effort and energy towards being a better developer. So it's only reasonable that I can put in at least some effort towards being a better person and a more caring teammate. So with that in mind, let's look at some practical ways that we can get better at caring together. So first up, code reviews. Whether it's product reviews, code reviews, or design reviews, the process of soliciting feedback about decisions and then incorporating that feedback is a relatively regular part of most developers' work. Now, there's a lot that we can say about how to make code reviews more caring, how we can be more caring in those actions. And Vaidehi covered a lot of that in our talk earlier, but I really just want to focus on one area. And that is the emotional and interpersonal aspects of these review processes. In a written version of her talk, she groups these under a header called the harder things, but the most important. Which leaves us with the question, why are these the harder things and why are they the most important things? It's because they're almost entirely all about people. Or more specifically, they're about people and communication. And so whether it's communication in the form of feedback or critiques, or even just a discussion about the way something was done, communication between a reviewer and a reviewee is really the avenue by which these reviews derive their value. If I leave a comment that's just LGTM looks good to me, that doesn't really tell you a whole lot, right? Like, what's good about it? Or did you even really look at it? Like, if you don't have anything specific to say, how do I know that you actually looked at it? And so, with this in mind, how can we incorporate more care into our communication process? Well, there's a lot of things we can do, and I don't plan to try to solve the entire gamut of interpersonal communication problems in a 20-minute talk, but I want to focus on one specific area, and that is your tone. So whether it's a review or an email or any form of written communication, we really need to make sure that we're not being tone deaf. What I mean by this is be cognizant of the tone that you're using when you're communicating. We've all, or most of us, have likely at one point or another interacted with someone that is either condescending, detached, or just negative in the way that they communicate. And just as those tones can be really draining in reviews and written communication, they're also draining in normal conversation. So we need to be conscious that we're not letting the fact that we're sitting behind a computer translate into the way that we're communicating to our coworkers through that computer, which can often happen. But to illustrate why I think tone is such an important part of our jobs, I want to share a brief story. So a little while ago, I was working on a project, and it was supported by a really skilled infrastructure team. The developers on the main project would defer to this infrastructure support team frequently because they had a lot of experience and expertise. However, some members of this infra team could come across as a bit condescending or aloof, especially when reviewing the code of developers that weren't experienced. So what resulted is that the developers working on this project began to avoid this infra team. And this led to problems in the project, problems that probably could have been avoided had they had the insight of these more experienced developers. And so the outcome here was that the project was negatively and directly impacted by the communication style of just a couple members of this team. It wasn't even the whole team, just some of them. And this impacted not only the project, but also relationships and the team's morale in the long run. So what can you do to make sure that things like this don't happen? Well, to start, if you've never really put thought into how you communicate and the tone that you're conveying, ask your coworkers. It can either be about reviews specifically or more generally about how you communicate. I can almost guarantee you that they will have something to say to you. Beyond that, ask them what they think that you can do to improve. In doing this, you're opening up a dialogue for you guys to figure out how to work better and more effectively together. But it's also important to realize that this isn't going to be something that you do once and you're done with it. Different teams and different individuals within a team are all going to have different communication styles. And you need to work together to find ways to improve that communication. This will let you collaborate more effectively, grow closer as a team, and avoid frustration and misunderstanding. So beyond soliciting this feedback, though, I also have a set of guidelines that I keep to help me keep my tone in check while I'm communicating. Those are: ask questions often, explain frequently, and never decree. So by asking questions, we're acknowledging the rationality and intelligence of the other person at the end of the review. By explaining, we share context and provide opportunities for others joining the conversation to learn. And then by not decreeing, we avoid coming across as condescending and out of touch with the experiences of other developers, which is often what it feels like. So if we apply these guidelines, how might the review comment from the beginning of Jake's day have looked? Well, instead of saying, "This won't work," and leaving it at that, his coworker may have instead chosen to say, "Why did you approach it this way? I'm not sure this will work because," and then insert his rationale. So this approach does several things. First, it acknowledges that Jake's a rational and logical and intelligent person. He likely had reasons for why he chose to approach the problem the way that he did. Second, it gives an opportunity for the reviewer to share context that Jake might be missing as to why this won't work. Or, on the other hand, it will allow Jake to see where the reviewer is missing context that Jake had while implementing the feature. And then finally, it shows that there was time and care put into reviewing Jake's hard work and not just being a drive-by where he left a flippant comment. And so the only real drawback here is that it will have taken the reviewer slightly more time to construct his review comment. But really putting in that little bit of time is the bare necessity that we should be asking of someone reviewing code that is going to be going to production. Now, there's a whole lot more I could say about communication and code reviews, or reviews in general, but I'll end this section with one more tip about improving your tone. And that is make opportunities for praise. What I mean by this is there are chances for you to encourage and support and be positive even when you have to provide critiques or potentially disagree with someone. If nothing else, simply drop in a comment like, "Great job," or "Thanks for all the hard work on this." Just do that from time to time. A little bit of positivity can go a long way. A constant barrage of technical comments and critiques and feedback can be really draining to everyone involved. But sending some positivity can really help restore that energy for someone that's having to be reviewed. This goes doubly so if you're a senior or a lead engineer, because that means there is probably someone looking up to you. And as such, you should be setting an example for how to be supportive of your teammates. So moving on, Jake had a slightly less than stellar encounter in a one-on-one meeting with his manager. Now, this meeting didn't necessarily need to be with his manager. It could have been with a coworker, a peer, a mentor, or anyone really. But the fact that it was his manager carried extra weight for Jake. But we also have to remember that Jake's manager probably wasn't trying to be malicious here. He just wanted a status update. And given the circumstances, he was likely under a lot of pressure to deliver as well. So if we step into the shoes of Jake's manager here, how can we make sure that we're being supportive while meeting with someone else? Well, the first thing that we should do is try to be flexible with our time. In one-on-one meetings, it means that this is someone that you meet with relatively regularly or are going to be meeting with regularly. It's important to acknowledge that you're meeting with someone else. And so while you may be coming to this meeting with a bunch of objectives and ideas about what you want to get out of it, the person you're meeting with is also coming with expectations about what they want to get out of it. And so, as a leader, or as someone that's leading a one-on-one, then you should practice being flexible with your time. If they have something important that they want to discuss, make sure that you make some room for it. If you have something absolutely critical that needs to be discussed with them, though, perhaps that should be another meeting, a different meeting from your one-on-one. This idea of being flexible with your time ties into a concept of psychological safety. So back in 2012, Google did a study called Project Aristotle that was aimed at discovering what made certain teams more effective than others. They researched over 100 teams in over several years and found that psychological safety was a key indicator of effective teams. But what does that mean? What is psychological safety? Well, in the field of psychology, it's a group trait that's marked by behaviors such as conversational turn-taking and high average social sensitivity. Now, if you're like me and not a psychologist, you might be thinking, okay, that doesn't make anything any more clear. So put more plainly, it's a sense that your group or your team will not embarrass, reject, or punish you for speaking up. So how does this tie into one-on-ones? Well, as someone that's hosting a one-on-one, it means that you have some level of influence. And as someone with influence, it's your responsibility to help create a psychologically safe workplace for your coworkers. And so, if you are allowing them to be able to come to you and feel confident that you will listen in your one-on-one meetings by being flexible with your time, then it will go a long way towards setting an example for them to feel comfortable speaking up in all circumstances, because they know that they value your voice and that they value your ability to have opinions and thoughts. So beyond ensuring that your team feels comfortable speaking up, though, you also need to make sure that you're hearing what they aren't explicitly telling you. So there's a quote by management guru Peter F. Drucker that says, "The most important thing in communication is hearing what isn't said." Now, this quote is often used to talk about nonverbal communication, but I believe that it's also applicable to verbal communication. You see, if you hear a bunch of developers complaining about a problem, but they're not explicitly asking for it to be resolved, you can still guess that there's something that needs to be done there. Or maybe it's not that obvious. Maybe you see a coworker who's, every time you talk to him, sounds really frustrated, but you don't know why. But you do know that he's been staying late at work a lot recently. In both of these cases, you can identify ways to help or to care for your teammates. In the first scenario, where you're hearing developers complain, escalate the problem. Find someone that can go fix it for them. Or if you're not sure how big of an issue it is, go talk to the developers and be pointed about figuring out if this is a true problem for them. In the latter scenario, where your coworker's being frustrated, go talk to him. See if you can take on some of the work. Or if you don't have the bandwidth to do that, go find his manager and ask him, hey, can we get more developers to help this guy out so he doesn't have to stay late? Or hey, can we get more, or can we change the expectations on when these things need to be delivered so that way he doesn't feel all this pressure? The point is that if you stop and look, there are likely things going on in your team that could be made better if someone took the time to notice them. So let's consider Jake's earlier meeting. Instead of asking about feature X right away, what if his manager had started their meeting by saying, I have something I'd like to talk about, but first, is there anything that you would like to talk about? This way, Jake knows that there's an opportunity there for him to talk about his frustrations, especially if there's something that's really weighing on him. It's important that his manager doesn't say something like, I have something very important that I want to talk about. Because if he does that, then Jake may be like, well, are my problems really that important? Maybe they can wait. On the flip side of this coin, though, Jake needs to recognize that there is something his manager wants to talk about. And so, if they use up all their time in the meeting talking about Jake's frustrations, then they should schedule another meeting. Jake should offer this. Caring goes both ways, and it's up to both parties to recognize this. Now, you might question at this point if this always makes sense. Right? What if the manager has a really critical business topic that's blocking another team? Or what if Jake's frustrations can't be resolved? Well, you'll need to use your best judgment. I mean, as with most things in software engineering, there's no one solution to everything. But be careful, because small problems and small frustrations have a habit of snowballing and turning into much larger issues. Now, there's plenty more that I could talk about in terms of meetings and building effective one-on-one meetings, but I want to end this section with one more tip. That is, go for a walk. If you've never done it before, try taking a walk during your one-on-ones. Anecdotally speaking, they can feel a lot more relaxed and laid back than sitting in a cold conference room across from someone. And especially if you have something difficult to discuss, it can be a lot easier to do that while you're looking at your feet or looking at the beautiful scenery around you, instead of sitting in a cold conference room staring into someone's eyes. That said, make sure that you take into account the person you're meeting with. This won't work for everyone. And so you should communicate with each other to find a structure that is effective and useful for both of you. So we've now talked about two specific work-related tasks that come up. But what about other day-to-day activities? If you're a developer, chances are you don't spend your whole day in meetings or doing code reviews, or at least I should hope not. So how do you care for your teammates if you're just getting lunch or chatting about tech or simply during a lull in the day at your desks? Well, my first tip here is to close the shop. As high-performing and really motivated individuals, it can be really easy for us to want to talk about work or talk shop all the time. And especially in the tech industry, I've met tons of people, especially at conferences like this, that love what they do and love their jobs, and that is fantastic. I'm super happy about that. But if that's all that I ever know about people, then I'm missing out on critical opportunities to build memories and stronger bonds and connections with my teammates. That means we're missing out on chances to build more collaborative teams that can work more effectively together and therefore deliver better products in the end. So we should inquire about family and friends, ask about their hobbies, talk about local events, or maybe even ask them about their favorite Netflix series. The possibilities really are almost endless. So if we think about Jake's earlier lunch conversation, what if instead of talking about new thing JS all lunch, his coworkers opened up by talking about what everyone had done over the weekend? Maybe Jake would have a chance to open up about how he's feeling with the project. And if his coworkers are feeling the same way, they can commiserate about it. Or if he feels that's too personal, he can at least sit back and hear about what's going on in the lives of his coworkers and find a way to connect with them that way. Now, this isn't to say that you should never talk about work, especially if you enjoy work outside of the office. But it is to say that try to put non-work things at the forefront every now and then. So I guess more accurately, instead of closing the shop, close the shop occasionally. Don't shut it down permanently. And I think you'll be surprised by how easy it is to find other things to talk about once you begin to understand your coworkers apart from their role at the office. And this goes a long way towards helping build a psychologically safe workplace because it's letting your coworkers know that, hey, you have value to me outside of the function that you're fulfilling while you're in the office. So at this point, it could feel like I'm prescribing a bunch of steps or a bunch of things that you have to do, checkboxes to check in order to build a caring and effective team. But that's not really the goal. My goal in this talk is to provide examples of how we translate this amorphous concept of caring or being empathetic and turn them into concrete actions that we can think about in practice or start incorporating into the work life. So I think author Bob Goff expressed the idea that for me lies behind all of this really succinctly in a book that he has called Love Does. And he says, you don't need a plan, you just need to be present. What does it mean to be present in this context, though? Well, it's not really so much about a specific moment or a location in time. It's about the environment and the workplace setting that you find yourself and your teammates in. There's this intersection of yourself and the unique personalities of your teammates and your work circumstances that is really the present moment for you. So being present allows you to see how the review comment you're about to leave might be interpreted negatively by your teammate. Or it will allow you to see that the person you're meeting with is looking worn out and really needs a break. And it also lets you recognize when your team is ready to celebrate a victory. And that last item is really important because it would be really easy to get the idea from this talk that caring only matters when bad stuff is happening at the office. But that's not true. Accomplishments, victories, celebrations, they all need to be shared. Because otherwise, if you're only around when bad stuff is happening to your coworkers or they're looking stressed out, then you're basically just a bad omen. And that's not a good teammate. So remember how Jake just kind of sulked back to his desk after lunch? We've all likely seen coworkers in a similar situation. Whether it's increased sighing or longer stares off into space or maybe more cursing or abnormal quietness, there are usually signs when people are feeling off or feeling down about what's going on in their job. Being present and actively giving them some attention from time to time allows us to recognize when people look off. And that's really important. Now, when we recognize people look off, though, it's really easy for us to think, oh, I'm just going to pretend that doesn't exist and ignore it. Because it's comfortable, right? We don't want to get involved in other people's mess. However, I would encourage you to take a deep breath and then lean in and simply ask them, hey, are you doing okay? Is there anything you want to talk about? Or maybe make it a bit more personal. Let them know, hey, you've been a bit more quiet than usual. Is everything okay? Sometimes that's all it takes to turn someone's day or entire week around. Just knowing that someone wants to listen. They may not necessarily open up, so don't push it. They don't have to tell you anything. But let them know that you're there and that you care and you're available. So as a brief example of this, one of the closest coworkers I ever had loved Martinelli's apple juice, as do I. But they didn't stock it in the building that we worked in. I know this is a Silicon Valley problem, but they stocked it in a building across our campus. And so we would often go for some walks to get some apple juice. On this walk, which only took a couple of minutes, was a chance for us to talk openly about whatever we wanted, without fear of other people being around. We could vent if we were really frustrated about something, or we could talk enthusiastically about something. And the point is that there was always an open invitation there to talk. But there was never an expectation. And that difference between expectation and invitation is really important. Because there is a sense that, hey, I have someone I can go to if I need, but I can also keep to myself if I want. And as an introvert, that's really important because I like my privacy. So all of this leads me to my final word of advice. And that's be available and be open. When I asked a group of managers and developers what they thought a developer should do to be a more caring and more empathetic teammate, almost half of them said something along the lines of, be available for your teammates and be open when you respond to them. The reasoning here is that being available makes you really approachable and can help you build relationships with your teammates. If you're never around or never at your desk and people don't know how to get a hold of you, then it may come across as if you're too busy or too important for your teammates, that you don't really care about them. Their needs aren't as important to you. So make some time. Try to be around and try to be available. But if you have to be at a lot of meetings, as I know some managers and lead devs do, then just let them know that you would prioritize requests from them to meet. Let them know that you're a priority, even if you can't physically be near them frequently. And then when you do respond in these circumstances, it's really important that you're open with the information you're giving. Most developers are astute people, and they can tell if someone is holding back information or just giving them just enough so that way you leave them alone. And that breeds a lot of distrust, right? Because it's telling them, hey, I don't have confidence in you to give you the whole story, or I don't have time to be bothered giving you the whole story. So be open, try to give until they seem satisfied with your response, and not necessarily when you think that they should be satisfied with your response. I know for myself this can be really difficult. If I have a big project that I need to finish or I have a lot of meetings for whatever reason, it can be really easy for me to just want to brush people off. But I found that taking the little bit of extra time to actually communicate effectively with them goes a long way towards building better relationships and building them into better developers, because it transfers knowledge to them and lets them know that, hey, I have confidence in you. I trust you to do your job well. To this advice, though, of being available and being open, I would also add be encouraging. As with praise in the review process, a little bit of encouragement can go a long way. If a junior dev is coming to you asking questions about how to implement a feature, end your conversation by letting them know that you're excited to see how it turns out. Or if you have to work on a hard problem with a peer, let them know that you're thankful that they're working on it with you and investing the time. Or maybe you find yourself asking a lot of questions from a lead developer or a senior engineer, and let them know, hey, thank you for taking the time to help me, and it's really benefiting me. Many of us are expected to do good work, and that's why we have jobs. But just because we're expected to do it doesn't mean it shouldn't be recognized and encouraged when we see it. It really takes a very small amount of energy to say some positive words to someone, but the amount of energy that that imparts to the other person can be really tremendous. It can help them be so much more productive. So to wrap up, I want to mention a quote by the paragon of Silicon Valley, Steve Jobs. He once said, "Great things in business are never done by one person. They're done by a team of people." And that last word to me is super critical to the sentiment expressed here. We're not UI engineers or senior developers or even employees, but we are human. Those titles might be part of how we think about ourselves, but they're not really part of our being. It's just something that we happen to do. So I urge you all to put forth a little bit of extra effort every day to care more for your fellow developers, your fellow people. And I think you'll be surprised by how much more effective your team will become and how much better people will grow. So maybe instead of focusing on getting shit done, as we are oft to say in this industry, we focus on growing people. My hope is that this talk has shown that being more caring or more empathetic doesn't require you to completely change your personality. It also doesn't require a lot of fancy process, but it does require you to put yourself in the shoes of your coworkers and understand what makes them unique. My hope is that this little bit of extra effort that we put in will help you experience a team that grows so much more than you ever have before. And from that labor, from that growing of other people, we can begin to go farther than we ever have before, both in the workplace and beyond, because there is really so much more to this life than just work. Thank you.